The man with the flowers, every year, without fail, he came alone. It didn't matter if the skies were pouring or the sun was sharp and dry. The tall man in the black coat would walk through the quiet cemetery with a single bouquet of white lilies in his hand. He wore no disguise. No one seemed to recognize him, and if they did, they respected his silence. But the groundskeeper always noticed. Old Frank, who had worked at Rose Hill Cemetery for nearly 30 years, had seen all kinds of people come and go. Mourning mothers, broken sons, widows with shaking hands. But this man was different. There was something in the way he stood still before that simple grave, something that made even the birds go quiet. Frank didn't know his name at first, not until the 5th year, when a younger staff member whispered with wide eyes, "Do you know who that is? That's Keanu Reeves." Frank didn't believe him at first, but then he watched Keanu walk to the same spot again, same flowers, same quiet kneel, same unreadable expression. And still, no one knew whose name was on that stone. It wasn't a famous actor, not a lost parent, not a sibling. The name was barely visible, worn down by time and rain. A small plaque at the base simply said, "You mattered." That was it. You mattered. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of Frank. He waited until Keanu left, then walked over and looked again. No last name, no birth year, just the first name carved into stone. Claire. Who was Claire? And why did the world's most beloved actor, known for his kindness and humility, visit her grave every year without saying a word to anyone? The mystery had never made the news. Keanu never mentioned her in interviews, not once. And when people asked about the cemetery visits, the rare few who caught a glimpse, he always changed the subject. It was like he was protecting something sacred, or someone. Frank didn't tell anyone, but he kept watching, year after year. Keanu would come, sometimes with tears in his eyes, sometimes holding the flowers a little tighter, but always alone. Then something changed. On the 13th year, Keanu didn't kneel. He stood for a long time, eyes closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he gently set the lilies down and whispered something into the wind. Frank couldn't hear it, but it looked like goodbye. That night, Frank finally decided to look into it. He had access to the old cemetery records, names, plots, dates, and what he found sent a chill down his spine. Claire, no last name, had been buried 19 years ago. The file was thin. No family listed, no obituary, no official headstone ordered, just a handwritten note attached. Private burial, covered by anonymous donor. A second note scribbled below. She had no one, but someone cared. Frank leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Who was this girl? Why no family? And who had cared enough to bury her with love? And then came the deeper question. Had Keanu Reeves been that someone? Was he the anonymous donor? 2 weeks later, the story might have ended there. But something happened that brought everything back to life. A young reporter named Jessica Taylor had been digging into a series about unsolved kindness, small stories, lost faces, forgotten gestures that had changed lives. She stumbled upon a forum post from years ago. A woman named Claire had written it. The post was short. I met a stranger on a rainy night in LA. I was thinking of ending everything. He sat beside me without asking. Didn't judge. Just shared his umbrella and listened. I never got his name. But he saved me. If you ever see this, thank you. The post had no replies. It was posted 11 months before Claire passed away. Jessica's heart pounded. Could it be? She dug deeper. Medical records, shelters, therapy clinics. Claire had struggled for years. Abuse, addiction, trauma. Yet for one short time, she had gotten clean. Even got a job at a diner. She'd told someone at the clinic she'd met an angel in the rain who gave her hope. And then, silence. Jessica tried to reach Keanu's team. No response. So she did something different. She left a note on Claire's grave. It read, "Whoever you are, thank you for caring. Her story is not forgotten." 1 week later, there was a second bouquet beside hers, and a note in simple handwriting. She gave more to this world than anyone knew. I was just lucky to meet her. It was signed with a single letter. Jessica never published the story. Instead, she wrote it in her journal and added one final sentence. "Sometimes the loudest love is the kind that never asks to be seen." And, old Frank? He never asked again. But every year, when he saw the tall man walking toward that quiet grave, he tipped his hat in silence. Because some stories don't need cameras. They just need hearts that remember. A voice in the rain had not stopped all night, long before he became a famous actor, long before cameras followed his every step. Keanu had walked the streets of Los Angeles like any other struggling artist. He had no umbrella, no agent, no destination. Only a coat too thin for the storm and a heart weighed down by quiet sadness. He remembered that night clearly, even now. The streets were quiet and the air was sharp with the smell of wet pavement. He was heading toward his small apartment when he noticed a figure sitting on the edge of a bridge. It was late. Most people were inside. But this girl was alone, soaked to the bone, her thin shoulders shaking, hair sticking to her face like vines. He slowed down, unsure at first. Then something about her posture, how still she was, made his steps quicken. "Hey," he said softly. No answer. He hesitated, then sat beside her. No words. Just sat there. The rain fell between them like a curtain. She didn't look up, but he noticed her fists were clenched tightly around the edge of the railing. And then, without turning her head, she whispered, "Why did you stop?" "Because you looked like you needed someone," he said. A pause. Then a fragile laugh, so dry it cracked. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to," he replied. "But I know what it feels like. To feel invisible." Her head slowly turned. Her eyes were red, but not just from the cold. He saw pain there. Real pain. The kind that came from years of being pushed aside, forgotten. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a half-wet sandwich wrapped in paper. "Not fresh," he said with a crooked smile, "but it beats the rain." She blinked, and for the first time she took a breath that didn't sound like goodbye. They sat together under the storm for almost an hour. No names were shared, no pasts explained. He offered his coat. She refused. He offered his umbrella. She finally took it. When she got up to leave, she paused. "You didn't try to fix me," she said quietly. "No one's broken," he replied. "Sometimes they're just hurting." She nodded. "My name's Claire," she said at last. He smiled gently. "I know." She looked confused. "How?" "Because Claire sounds like someone who deserves to be seen." She left that night, but she didn't vanish. Months passed. Keanu didn't think he'd ever see her again, but he remembered her every time it rained, remembered her silence, her strength, her pain. Then one afternoon, while filming a small project, he walked into a diner near the set. There she was, apron tied, hair pulled back, wiping down tables with tired hands and a quiet smile. She didn't see him at first. He didn't want to embarrass her, didn't want to break the moment. So he left a generous tip and a folded napkin on the table with a note. "You look stronger than the storm now." "Kay." He watched from across the street. When she opened the napkin, she froze. Then slowly looked. Up, scanning the street. But Keanu was already gone. She kept that note. He would never know just how much it meant. For 2 more years, Claire stayed clean. She saved money. She helped others in the shelter where she used to sleep. She was becoming someone new, not because he fixed her, but because he reminded her she was never truly broken. But life wasn't always fair. A car crash. No known family. Few records. When the city prepared to list her as unclaimed, one silent figure stepped forward to cover the burial. Keanu never spoke about it. He simply made sure she had a place where someone would remember her name. A place where the words, "you," mattered were carved not as a cliché, but as a truth. In the present, Jessica stood by that same grave. The young reporter had spent weeks piecing the story together. Not for clicks, not for headlines, but because she believed in quiet kindness. As she stood there with the printed forum, post in hand, she thought of her own life. How many people had passed her by when she needed someone? How rare it was for someone to just sit and listen. She bent down and left a single sunflower on the grave. "Thank you, Claire," she whispered. "And thank you, whoever you are." Behind her, a soft voice spoke. "You came back." She turned quickly. It was Keanu, older, calmer, but unmistakable. He gave her a small nod, eyes warm but tired. She froze, unsure what to say. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," he said gently. Claire would have liked that someone cared. There was silence between them. And then he said, "Sometimes the people we lose are the ones who taught us how to live." And, just like that, he placed the lilies down again, walked away, leaving only the rain and the echo of a stranger's kindness. The shelter of silence. The next morning, Jessica couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. She had come to the cemetery hoping for answers. Instead, she had received a moment. Soft, powerful, and unspoken. Keanu Reeves, the man loved by millions, had simply walked away after laying down the lilies. There were no cameras, no security, no press. Just him and his promise. Jessica sat at her desk, looking at the photos she didn't take. Her phone had stayed in her pocket the whole time. Not because she forgot, but because it felt wrong to turn something sacred into a headline. But deep inside, she knew she couldn't let Claire's story be forgotten. She opened her notebook and wrote 3 words. Claire was loved. Then she began to dig deeper. 3 days later, Jessica stood outside a worn brick building on the edge of downtown. A woman at the shelter had pointed her here, a place where Claire had once spent cold nights and long days trying to rebuild her life. Inside, the air was warm and smelled like soup. Children laughed in the distance. Volunteers moved quietly, folding blankets and serving meals. A middle-aged woman named Lara met her near the door. She had kind eyes and a tired smile. "You said you're looking for someone named Claire?" Lara asked. Jessica nodded. Lara's eyes softened. "I remember her." They sat together in the small break room. Lara poured 2 cups of tea, then paused, staring into her mug. "Claire was one of the quiet ones," she said. "Kept to herself at first. Always wore that old blue hoodie. But when someone else was hurting, she noticed." Jessica listened carefully. "One time," Lara continued, "a teenage girl came in, bruised, scared, hadn't eaten in 2 days. Claire gave her food, even though she barely had enough for herself. Then she sat beside her all night without saying much." Lara smiled sadly. "She told me once, 'I don't want people to feel invisible like I did.'" "Did she ever talk about a man?" Jessica asked carefully. "Someone she met in the rain?" Lara looked at her, surprised, then slowly nodded. "Yes. She mentioned him once. Said he didn't ask questions. Just sat with her. She said it was the first time she felt human again. Did she ever say his name? Jessica asked, holding her breath. Lara shook her head. No. But she called him her umbrella man, said he made her feel safe. Jessica's heart ached. She closed her notebook and said, "Thank you. You've given me more than you know." That night, Jessica walked alone through the city. The clouds had gathered again, and a soft drizzle fell across the streets. People rushed past her, umbrellas up, jackets tight. But she walked slowly, remembering Claire, remembering what it felt like to be seen. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of a book. An old tattered poetry journal. The message read, "She gave this to me once. I thought maybe you'd want to see it." No name, just the letter K. Jessica stared at the screen. She felt like crying. She replied with just 2 words, "Thank you." Minutes later, another message arrived, a page from the journal, in Claire's handwriting. "He sat beside me, not to save, not to speak, but to see. And for the first time I didn't want to disappear." Jessica gently placed her hand over her heart. She had come searching for a story. But what she found was something bigger, something most people missed in their rush to be seen, the quiet power of seeing others. Meanwhile, Keanu sat in a small cabin on the edge of the hills. The place had no internet, no phones, just a fireplace, 2 chairs, and shelves full of books. It was his retreat, his place to breathe. He stared out the window, watching the rain fall against the glass. The journal was in his hand. He hadn't read it in years. Claire had given it to him after they crossed paths a second time. After that diner moment when she'd realized he had remembered her. He had asked nothing in return. But a week later, she had handed him the small book with a shy smile. I wrote, "Poems to stay alive," she said. "Maybe one day you'll read them." He had, every page, every tear-stained line. He never told anyone, not even those closest to him, because to him that journal wasn't just paper. It was proof that even the smallest act of kindness could echo, for a lifetime. Back at her apartment, Jessica printed out every poem Claire had written. She put them in a folder labeled "The Girl Who Mattered," and on the final page, she wrote a message. Sometimes, heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they just sit beside you in the rain and remind you that you're still here. She didn't publish the story. Not yet. Some stories, she realized, don't belong to the world. They belong to the people they changed. The girl who mattered. Jessica sat alone at her desk, the folder of Claire's poems open in front of her. Candlelight flickered on the table, soft and warm, as if even the room understood the weight of what she was reading. She had read each poem. Twice now. Some were messy, others perfectly written. Some were just fragments, a line, a phrase, a feeling. But all of them held something deep. Pain, beauty, silence, survival. And one thing connected them all, hope. Jessica gently ran her fingers over the last page again. Claire's words whispered across the paper like a breeze. I don't want to be remembered as a broken girl. I want to be remembered as the one who kept walking. Jessica wiped a tear from her cheek. She had never met Claire, yet it felt like they had known each other forever. She knew now. This was more than a story. This was a legacy. But how could she honor it without turning it into another headline? A week passed. Jessica didn't publish anything. Instead, she started visiting the shelter more often, volunteering quietly, listening, helping. She didn't talk about her job or the story. She just showed up, day after day, because something in her had changed. Then one evening, Lara handed her something, an old folded paper with the corner torn. It had Claire's handwriting on it. If I ever get better, I want to create a place where people like me can write. Not to become famous, just to be heard. Lara smiled gently. She left it in a book once. We never threw it away. Jessica took the paper and held it close. A thought began to bloom. Meanwhile, in the quiet hills, Keanu lit the fireplace in his cabin. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. It was his time to reflect. Something he did every year around the same date, Claire's Day. He looked at the small wooden box on the shelf. It had no lock, no fancy design. Just a smooth finish and the initials CW carved into the lid. Inside was her journal. The same one he had kept safe all these years. He remembered their last conversation clearly. She had found him again, just once more. It was outside a bookstore. She had been standing near the entrance, nervously holding something in her hands. "Wrote you something," she said. He looked surprised, but smiled softly. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." She handed him the journal. And before he could say anything else, she added, "Thank you for seeing me." That was the last time he saw her alive. He never told anyone, because her life wasn't a headline. It was a quiet song, and he had promised never to let the world forget the music. Back in the city, Jessica made a decision. She met with Lara again. "This time with a new idea. What if we started a writing program at the shelter?" Jessica said. "Not for fame, not for clicks, just for the people here, just like Claire dreamed." Lara smiled. She would have loved that. They called it the Claire Project, a safe space with notebooks, pens, and silence, a room with warmth and open hearts. Each week people came and wrote, some shared, some didn't, but they all had one thing in common: their words mattered. Jessica didn't publish an article. She didn't chase headlines. Instead, she printed a small booklet of Claire's poems and gave it only to the people at the shelter. On the first page it read, "Dedicated to the umbrella man, who reminded her she was never truly alone. Keanu." Heard about it 6 weeks later. A small envelope arrived at his cabin with no return address. Inside was the booklet of Claire's poems. On the back page, a short handwritten message. "We honored her wish. Thank you for keeping her light alive." He held the booklet in both hands, quietly overwhelmed. Then he walked outside into the fading light, sat on the porch, and read each word slowly. By the time he finished, the stars had come out. He looked up and whispered, "You did it, Claire." Then he stood, went inside, and began writing something on a blank sheet of paper. His own memory, his side of the story. Not for the press, not for the world, just for her. Weeks passed. And then something unexpected happened. A child at the shelter found the courage to stand up and read his first poem aloud. A mother wrote her first letter to her daughter after years of silence. A man who hadn't spoken in months wrote a single line that made everyone cry. Claire's dream was alive. And without ever knowing it, she had become the reason dozens of people started to believe in their own stories again. People who were once invisible, now writing themselves into existence, not with loud voices, but with steady hands. Keanu returned to the cemetery one more time that year. This time, he brought something different. No lilies. Instead, he placed the small booklet of poems beside the grave. He didn't say a word, but his eyes glistened, and if someone had been close enough to hear, they might have caught a whisper in the wind. "You mattered more than you knew." The memory keeper, it was late evening when Jessica received the letter. No envelope, no name on the front. Just a folded piece of cream paper slipped under the shelter's door. She picked it up, heart already beating fast. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, familiar now. It was Keanu's. The note read, "Thank you for honoring her memory without turning it into noise. She lived quietly. She died quietly. But you gave her voice to those who feel voiceless. This is what she would..." Have wanted. Jessica read it 3 times. No signature. Just the letter K at the bottom. She folded it gently and placed it inside the back cover of Claire's poetry booklet. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had helped build. The Claire project had become more than a room with paper and pens. It had turned into a movement within the shelter, and beyond. It was giving people power, not the loud kind, the kind that healed. 3 weeks later, something unexpected happened. A young film student named Miles walked into the shelter. He was quiet, maybe 23, wearing headphones and carrying a notebook filled with ideas. He had heard about the Claire project through a friend who volunteered. "I want to make a short film," he told Jessica nervously. "Not for money, not for fame, just to tell her story. Maybe it'll help others." Jessica hesitated. This wasn't about turning Claire into content, but something in the boy's eyes reminded her of herself. Before she had known how powerful quiet stories could be, she asked him a question. "What will you call it?" He didn't hesitate. "You mattered." That was the moment Jessica said yes. Keanu heard about the film through a mutual friend in the non-profit world. At first he said nothing. But late that night, sitting near the fireplace at his quiet cabin, he picked up Claire's old journal once again, flipping to the back. He found a short, unfinished note she had once written. "If someone ever tells my story, I hope they show the light too. Not just the rain." He smiled faintly, then made a quiet decision. He would visit the shelter, not as a celebrity, not as Keanu Reeves, but as the man who once sat beside a broken soul in the rain. The visit was unannounced. When he walked into the shelter's main hall, heads turned, not because of who he was, but because of how he carried himself. Quiet, humble, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. Lara greeted him, stunned but composed. "We didn't think you'd ever come," she said softly. "Neither." "Did I?" he replied. He didn't make speeches, didn't take pictures. Instead, he sat in the back of the Claire project room, listening. One by one, people shared their writings. A young woman read a poem about losing her brother to the streets. A teenage boy talked about the night he almost gave up, until someone handed him a notebook. An elderly man, once homeless, shared a letter he had written to his daughter after 10 years of silence. The stories weren't polished, but they were real, and each one carried a piece of Claire in it. After the final reading, Keanu stood. His voice was soft but steady. "I once knew someone who believed no one saw her, but she ended up lighting the way for more people than she could ever imagine." And then he sat down again. There was no applause, only silence. But it was the kind that said everything. The film, You Mattered, was never released in theaters. It was uploaded quietly on a small platform and shared by a few communities online. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't viral, but it changed lives. One comment read, "I watched this in my car. I cried for a stranger. I needed that." Another, "This made me write my first poem in 10 years. Thank you." And one simply said, "I never met Claire, but I think she saved me." Keanu watched the film alone. He didn't tell anyone he was watching. He sat in his cabin, lights off, listening to Claire's words being spoken by actors who'd never known her, but somehow still captured her spirit. At the end of the film, the screen faded to black, and the final words appeared, dedicated to all the people who feel invisible. "You are seen. You are heard. You matter." Keanu closed his eyes. He felt tears trace his cheek. But this time they weren't tears of sorrow. They were the kind that come when you realize love doesn't end with a grave. It continues. In poems. In voices. In quiet rooms full of people who finally believe their stories are worth telling. That same night, Jessica lit a small candle and placed it near Claire's grave. She brought a notebook and wrote a message on the first page. "Dear Claire, they heard you. They remember you. You helped the world without ever trying to. And the man who sat with you in the rain, he's still walking with you, every step. Then she closed the notebook, laid it beside the flowers, and walked away, heart full, eyes shining, and above her, for the first time in weeks, the clouds finally began to part. Echoes that never fade. Spring came early that year. The cemetery looked different now. The trees had bloomed early, casting soft petals across the graves. Birds returned, their gentle songs floating in the air. And Claire's resting place once, unnoticed and quiet, had become something more. Someone had placed a small wooden bench beside it. Engraved on the side were 3 simple words. You mattered, Claire. It wasn't loud or fancy, but people sat there now, sometimes in silence, sometimes reading poems, sometimes crying without shame, and every so often someone left behind a note. I came here because I needed peace. I didn't know her, but I understand her. Thank you for reminding me I still belong here. Claire's grave had become a quiet sanctuary for the broken, the healing, and the forgotten, and she never even knew what she started. Jessica stood by the bench, watching a child scribble something in a tiny notebook. The boy looked up at her and smiled shyly. My mom says Claire was like a superhero, he said. Jessica knelt beside him. She was. Not the kind who flies, the kind who listens. The boy nodded. I'm writing her a poem. Can I hear it? She asked. He hesitated, then opened the page. Thank you for staying, even when it was hard. You made it better, for people with scars. Jessica smiled with wet eyes. That's beautiful. And it was. Meanwhile, far from the city, Keanu stood alone at a quiet movie set between takes. He had just filmed an emotional scene, one that strangely reminded him of Claire. As the crew adjusted lights and cables, he stepped away and sat in a folding chair, lost in thought. He pulled out a letter from his coat pocket. Not a script, not fan mail. A letter from a woman named Ava, one of the first participants in the Claire project. She had seen his short message printed in the back of the poem booklet. She hadn't written in over a decade, but after joining the project, she found her voice again. Her words were simple. You didn't fix her. You sat with her. And that gave her strength to stay just one more day. That day saved the rest of us. He folded the letter back with care and breathed deeply. Claire's story wasn't finished, not in death, not in silence. It was growing, like light passed from one candle to the next. And he had simply been the first flame. Weeks later, the Claire project launched its second shelter chapter in another city, and then a third. The idea was never about size. It was about soul. A safe place for stories, without judgment, without fame, just truth. Each location had a small wooden plaque above the writing table to the girl who kept walking, and under it, always a single line that never changed. You matter. On the 15th anniversary of Claire's passing, Keanu returned to Rose Hill. He walked the same path, coat brushing against wild grass, eyes calm, but full. The bench was clean, flowers fresh, and on the stone someone had placed a folded paper tied with string. He picked it up and opened it. Inside was a hand-drawn sketch of Claire. It wasn't perfect, but the smile, it captured something rare, gentle, strong. At the bottom, a note. You saved me once, even if you didn't know it. He smiled, then sat on the bench in silence. For an hour he didn't speak, just listened. To the birds, to the wind, to the memory of a girl who had sat in the rain ready to vanish, and instead chose to live one more day. And because of that day, hundreds more had found a reason to stay. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Keanu stood and placed a small book of new poems on the grave, not written by him, but by those who had come after. Then he whispered, "This World hurt you, but you helped it heal. He turned and walked away. No cameras, no crowds, just footsteps fading into the soft rustle of leaves. But somewhere, deep within that breeze, her voice echoed back. Not in pain, not in sadness, but in peace. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was visiting a grave. He was visiting a legacy.